How's everyone feeling today? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, save your voices though, you know, it's only day 2. So we want to welcome you all to the Science and Tech of Captain Marvel. So show of hands, who is here because they just love science and technology? Oh, okay. And who is here because they love Captain Marvel?
Also.
Okay, now the most important question for our panelists is, who here has seen the movie? Okay, I will warn you, there may be some spoilers. We're gonna try to stay away from anything that's actually like storyline directly killing, but we are really wanting to deep dive into the theatrical version of Captain Marvel. So if you've seen the preview though, most of the previews give you a lot of the tech already, so hopefully nothing is too big of a spoiler. Okay, so she served as a pilot, a U.S. Air Force officer, an intelligence officer, a NASA security guard. This resume is going to keep going. She's run with the X-Men, Starjammers, Guardians of the Galaxy, been an Avenger, an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., a member of the Ultimates, a member of the A-Force, leader of the Banshee Squadron, and head of Alpha Flight. So obviously, with a resume like that, we now know why Captain Marvel is the first female to be given her own Marvel universe and a headliner movie, right? It makes complete sense to me, at least. So I know probably you all are thinking, well, Captain Marvel is set back in the 90s, so how are we going to talk about tech when they had computers that were the weight of small children and they had pagers? But the cool part of it is that there is actually a lot of really awesome tech, and I have some absolutely incredible people here that are gonna help me dive deep into that. So I want them to introduce themselves because they're gonna do it way better than I will.
Okay, hi, I'm Larry Silverberg. I'm a professor here at NC State. We got any NC State people here?
Wolfpack.
Hey, okay, great. Anyway, so I'm what's called a dynamicist, and that means I study movement, how things move, why things move, kind of the science of movement.
Hey, I'm Siena Fallon. I am one of the directors of NC Comicon. I run the media and communications. If you guys are local, I also manage 2 of the Ultimate Comic stores in Durham and Cary, so you might have seen me there. Yep. Science fan too.
Yes, and I'm Matt Connor. I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm going to talk about the brain science behind the movie.
And those of you that have been by my booth, or those of you that have Discovery, may know me as Tamara Robertson from Mythbusters. I guess I am actually Tamara Robertson all the time. And I go across the nation doing things like this, talking about superhero science and trying to get more kids into STEM. So that's going to be kind of where we kick off. So hopefully we have the expertise between us to be able to kind of cover this topic, but also to answer your questions. So please, while we're talking, think about questions, write them down, keep them in your head. We're wanting to really have a fun engagement with you at the end. And there's even a little tiny Captain Marvel in it for the first person that's brave, just saying. Okay, so kicking it off. So the release of the Captain Marvel movie has been anticipated since Miss Marvel became Captain Marvel in 2012 with Kelly Sue McDeconnick. So Siena, it's my understanding that you're a member of the Carol Corps.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, Kelly Sue's run on Captain Marvel was one of the first Marvel books I started reading in single issues, and when she took over the book, she created this thing called the Carol Corps, and that's what she named all the big fans of the book. There were a lot of big fans of seeing Carol Danvers become Captain Marvel, kind of assume this legacy position. So yeah, definitely a member of the Carol Corps. I have my Captain Marvel #1 signed by Kelly Sue DeConnick, so I was super jazzed to be invited to be on this panel.
Yeah, so can you maybe share, so for people that may not be as familiar with the comic version of Captain Marvel, can you kind of share that evolution from, in 1968, Captain Marvel actually being the sidekick to a male Captain Marvel, to what we have today, where again, she's the first female to be given a cinematic universe?
Right, yeah, so Captain Marvel originally, some people were complaining on the internet, you know, Captain Marvel was a guy. He started out, he's a Kree, super powerful, came to Earth, became a superhero, and Ms. Marvel was just kind of, she showed up as a side character in his book, and the original origin story is that she gets her powers in kind of this big accident, this explosion that happens, and eventually they kind of explain her powers is because she has Kree DNA mixed with human DNA, and that's kind of what makes her super strong. So she gets her own book, and she is Ms. Marvel. It's kind of like a legacy character because Captain Marvel was still around, kicking. And she has her own book for a while. She loses her powers at one point, and I thought this would be cool to talk about on the science panel. She regains her powers as a character named Binary. Instead of going by Ms. Marvel, she adopts the name Binary, and she has crazy power off the charts because she can access the power of a white hole. And so she becomes honestly one of the more powerful superheroes in the Marvel universe at that point. She does become a little bit depowered after that, but she still has some of the binary abilities, including the ability to absorb energy and then redirect it in like photon blasts, which I thought would be cool to talk about on the panel too, because we saw that in the movie when she was shooting out those blasts that you saw. Those were like, she was redirecting energy and shooting out these photon blasts.
Yeah, so it was actually really interesting, and this isn't a storyline killer, but she doesn't, like, I noticed in the movie she doesn't actually always hold something to absorb the power first, like
right.
Sometimes she's just blasting. But what's really cool is that we have actually been working on directionalized energy blasts to be able to take out space debris as well as any missiles coming. So like,
oh, cool.
Within the next 10 years, that's gonna be something that is definitely technically here, but I don't think a human being able to do it obviously is
like blast from her hands. Yeah, that'll be a little different. But yeah, she is pretty much now, she is considered one of the top power levels in the Marvel universe, just one of the most powerful Avengers. She's on the Avengers currently, and she has her own book as Captain Marvel. Like you said, in 2012, she assumed Captain Marvel's name. The original Captain Marvel had been dead for a while. He passed on from cancer, and it kind of became the right time for her to assume the name. And yeah, she's been Captain Marvel ever since, and just on the Avengers and kicking butt.
Awesome. Now one part of the storyline from the comic series that we definitely see in the cinematic universe coming to is her struggling with her identity and her sense of self. In the comics, when she would be Mrs. Marvel, she wouldn't have any recollection of her as Carol, and then vice versa. So, Matt, can you kind of talk to us about the different types of trauma, obviously, that Carol went through, and how that lends itself to changing that science of the brain and leading to amnesia and the flashbacks that we kind of see in the film?
Yeah, so I'm a psychiatrist, and I work with disorders of the brain in a certain type of way. So to start out, I want to talk to you a little bit about what brain parts, as far as hardware goes, are important to memory. We have a few different types of memory. For instance, there's the implicit memory, which is like a skill, like how to drive a car, and we store that in one part of the brain called like the frontal lobe, and we keep that for a while. It's hard to forget some of your skills as long as you're relatively practiced, and as we saw with the movie, there were a lot of physical moves that she could do that she couldn't quite know why she could do them, but she could do them, and that's because they're implicit memory. Explicit memory is more of like, where did you park your car? And that is in a different part of the brain, and after a couple of weeks, probably mediated by sleep, it goes to more widespread storage in the brain. And there's two places that it stores in the most part, and I really, really like the distinctions, because the first one is called the hippocampus, which is Latin for seahorse, because in the brain it looks kind of like a little seahorse. And anyway, that's the factual memory, like who was president in what year or whatever. Then there's another part of the brain called the amygdala, which is Latin for almond because it looks like an almond. It's a lot less cute than the hippocampus. But it's the emotional part of the memory. So if you have a little stroke there, you might remember that your mom died, but you aren't really sad about it. You don't have the memory of being sad. It's not like it's suddenly awesome, but all of our emotional memories are put there. If you have a smell that reminds you of like your ex, that's there. If you remember that you have an ex, that's there, the hippocampus. And so there's a lot of times where Carol in the movie is remembering emotion, but she doesn't have a fact to put to it, and it's because we'll put some leeway toward sci-fi movie science, but in real life, people who have damage to one or the other behave a lot like she does, where some parts are still accessed and some parts just aren't there anymore. And that's hardware. That's what neurologists do. I work more with the software, which is the mind, which is the system of attention and programs that accesses memories at the right times and makes an identity, that makes a self. And trauma affects a lot of the way that we pull memories up and make sense of memories. In PTSD, which if you guys are here tomorrow, we're doing a PTSD panel at noon, and we'll go into more depth about how this part works. But the science of PTSD, if a memory is too scary, if it's too associated with something that almost killed you, then your brain is going to put that away. It's going to say, let's not go there. This is too much. And that can generalize to where all of the parts are still there, all of the hardware is still intact, but you can't reach it because the brain says not safe, not good. That's called dissociation, and there's different levels, but the part that seems to most apply to Captain Marvel is dissociative fugue, which is rare, but we all learn about it because it's super cool. The idea that your brain shuts down entirely who you were and builds a new self, like being an actor or something. And so this happened a lot more in like the 50s and 60s when we didn't have as widespread government identification. But people would show up at the doctor and be like, this lady showed up at my house and says that she's my wife, but I've been married to this woman for like 5 years. But it turns out that 7 years ago, this trauma had happened, the person had totally forgotten who they were, ended up somewhere else, married somebody else, has a new family, and they just don't track them down. And so this is rare, but what happened to Carol in the movie is not too far from what we know can happen to the brain when the software gets disrupted by trauma.
Intriguing. So I remember from high school, I think, my physics teacher would talk about particles and waves and lots of equations, because I feel like, you know, we have both that memory portion, but then that she's already struggling with, but then we also see the scrolls like messing with her memory and her perception. So, Dr. Silverberg, like, does science explicitly deal with perception? Is that part of why she's having some of this go on? Is that a thing?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. There's a connection between the hard science, or the physics, I would say, and the psychiatry. Mm-hmm. But you know, normally, right now, we kind of keep those separate. So when we talk about maybe the physical system of the mind, or a lot of the behavioral patterns and the trauma and everything like that, we kind of think of those as separate. So if you're in school, you might talk about particles and waves. You brought that up. Its connection to perception is very loose. So you might not even see any relationship between physics, particles, waves, and perception, and that's kind of classical science. But there really is a modern science, which starts around the 1950s, 60s, which you don't actually learn in school, which is based on perception, which actually does connect more psychiatry and things like that. And let me try to explain it. Actually, a good way to explain it is to think about magic. In magic tricks, you make things appear and disappear, and everybody knows that doesn't make any sense. Or you put an object under a scarf and it starts undergoing involuntary motion, and you know that doesn't make any sense. And those are perceptions. You basically believe that things need to be moving continuously. You need to believe that simple objects can't just move themselves. That's actually those are two basic perceptions. You don't learn about that in school, but actually from those basic perceptions, you actually can derive the laws of science. Maxwell's equations, Newton's laws. These are, when you take science classes, there's all these equations that you're going to learn. Lots and lots of equations. And you'll learn about particles and waves, and that dates back to the 19th century. But actually, modern science actually does start from broad perceptions. And maybe someday we'll actually connect what we learn in physics with what we learn in psychiatry, and we'll see a little more of a common denominator in all of those things. And in some respects, science fiction projects what's going to happen in the future intuitively. So I think, you know, for all you science fiction fans there, I think it's great because the imagination in science fiction will drive a lot of us to move from hard science to, it kind of instinctively is about what could be possible, but we're not sure how yet. And anyway, good question.
So if it's somewhere that we're going next, a follow-up question is, do you think if our, you know, scientific entities are able to make a technology like the Skrulls have to start reordering your memories and focusing in on what they need to do, do you think that this is something they would use for good, or do we need to worry that they're going to be trying to access everything we have when they need that information?
Science, is it good or is it evil? You know, it seems it's kind of there's big struggle going on. It's kind of the struggle of the ages of science and data and information and who controls it. Do we control it, or do our large institutions control it? It's definitely powerful in our own hands, in the hands of everyday people. So long as we have control over it, it's going to be a force of good. But this movie and many other movies kind of inherently are about who's controlling the information, who's telling us what to do. Are our institutions telling us what to do and what we need, or are we going to retain freedom? And so that's kind of the question of the ages.
There's an element of that actually did apply to psychiatry in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of belief in recovered memories, that you had stuff that was buried, but if I gave you drugs and hypnotism and some really strong suggestions, you would remember what I kind of want you to remember. And so a lot of people grew this horrible false belief that they had been traumatized as children. There were a lot of beliefs in cults that didn't exist, or a lot of places where reports of molestation were happening that weren't actually being able to be validated. And it's because these well-meaning, I hope, psychiatrists were trying to help people uncover trauma to explain why things were wrong, and were so busy looking for this trauma that they ended up actually falsely inventing it. And as a result, the recovered memories that you see on like TV shows are not admissible in court, because we know that there's very low likelihood that that actually came from somewhere. And if you do hypnotism, which we still do, it's not as common, but we do still do hypnotism, you have to be very careful to document as little suggestion as possible. It's like, you can say, okay, you're in a relaxed state, think back, you're this age, what's going on, but you can't say, you're this age, picture this happening, does this feel right to you or not? Or how many cults were there in your neighborhood active? And did your dog disappear because he was sacrificed or whatever? You can't ask that, but we did back in the 80s and 90s because we thought we were helping. And so there's a case where you're talking about science being a tool that can be used for good or evil, but I would say even accidentally, a tool that's not understood can end up evil even if it's used for good.
I mean, that kind of ties into the movie. I don't want to get into too many spoilers, too, because we see when her memories are being messed with, she's kind of given suggestions to explain why there's these missing gaps. And I think that meshes well with what you just said, why Carol's memories seem wrong, and she starts trusting people that maybe she shouldn't trust or wouldn't normally trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. I like that. Okay. So we touched a little bit on her photon blasters, which you end up seeing in the film. And one of the things that for me as an engineer, like watching her, there is one point, and this isn't giving a spoiler away, but there's a hole created in a spaceship, and obviously the vacuum of space is trying to suck her in. And it was a great like Newtonian moment where she like uses the blasters to like force her the opposite way. And like I'm like, the amount of force she must have to be able to blast away from the suction of space was incredible. But there's also the Skrulls, right, like where they're actually able to kind of chameleon and change. So kind of sticking on the like a biology subject, when we see that happen and they're shape-shifting so much, and it's like she says they can shape-shift all the way down to the DNA level, like what do you guys think that would actually like mean for someone, especially when we see them changing as many times as we're seeing it happen in the film with Halos, especially? Like, is there a risk in that that change? You know, we obviously know in humans if a cell changes that drastically in the DNA, like, or the shift of it occurs, it becomes a tumor or becomes a cancer. Like, so what do you think long term that would mean for the scrolls, and especially I would love to hear also from an identity standpoint, because they are taking on so many of the memories as well.
It's interesting because they almost treat it kind of flippantly in the movie, where it's kind of like a joke and they talk of it almost from like an acting perspective rather than assuming an identity. But I think, yeah, if we're talking about real life and changing down to the DNA, I don't think it would be as flippant as like I'm taking on a role and I need to learn a new accent, which was kind of some jokes in the movie, maybe, Matt.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about learning theory is, okay, I am terrified of butterflies, it's just my thing. But like a caterpillar, they don't have really advanced brains, they don't do a lot, but you can train caterpillars to a certain extent to like go down toward the right because that's where the good leaves are or whatever. A caterpillar goes in a cocoon and it melts. It goes into just essentially a soup of protein that is then going to reform into a butterfly. And what we know is if you train a caterpillar, the butterfly knows it. There was at no point in this soup that they were nerves. There was no brain in the soup. It was just protein, and yet when it came back together, it knew something different. And so I would project the Skrulls had something like that, some element of preservation of encoding in the basic DNA to put memories in a proper order or nerves in a proper order, as long as the skull could accommodate the brain that allowed that. But yeah.
It almost reminds me of stuff we learned about in biology with kind of like epigenetics and kind of having this memory that kind of sticks around in different generations. So if we're thinking about Skrulls changing their DNA, it's almost like they're becoming a new person or a new organism. But I can't speak to it very well, but there's studies that show that like trauma that happens in generations, like famines that happen and hit a generation in a certain area, that you can see the effects in their descendants. So it's kind of like this learned memory that affects the epigenetics of these descendants of people who have had a famine. So it's kind of interesting and similar.
It's really cool. Yeah. Oh, well, obviously we could probably sit here and talk all day about Captain Marvel, but we do want to invite you guys to line up if you have questions. We really want to engage with you and hear what you guys wonder about. It can be comic or theater-based, like feel free. And
someone needs to hand him the microphone.
Yeah, we might need to, how about this? I'm going to go down and hand him the mic. Can you tell them while I'm doing that where to find you, if both here at the con and as well as in the normal universe?
Sure, I'm on Instagram at Matthew James Connor. It's Connor with an E.
I'm on Twitter, Siena Writes. This weekend I'm running around the floor, or you can find me in person at one of the Ultimate Comics stores.
I'll be hanging around here for the next 10-15 minutes.
And Tamara, is it T-Lin R? T-Lin R85.
And I'm across from Jeremy Woodley in the 500.
Is it the 500?
In the 500.
So in the 500s you can find Tamara's booth, and she'll be there all weekend.
Yes.
What is the difference between a white hole and a black hole?
It's a great question.
This
is-
Since you brought that up, you should.
I run comic book stores. I just thought it was cool, but I'm sorry, I don't have the answer. I can Wikipedia it and then answer it later.
You've stumped everybody.
I'm like wondering if it has something to do with the door. I don't know. No, I have no idea. I'm not going to even talk. It's a different color.
But great question.
And you get.
I'm gonna look it up.
Marvel.
Okay, this makes sense. White hole. It's hypothetical. Oh, I'll wait till he's listening again. So what I'm getting about white holes they are hypothetical, and it's kind of, they call it a white hole versus a black hole because it's almost the reverse. You can't enter a white hole, where with a black hole, it sucks in everything around it. You can't enter the space surrounding a white hole, but matter and light can escape a white hole, whereas they cannot escape a black hole.
White is all the different colors together is white, and black is nothing. So, you know, coming toward us.
So yeah, that would be
Would be
white,
white.
white, because you could see the light and matter escaping because it would be coming out of the hole, whereas in a black hole, you wouldn't see anything because all the light is being sucked into it.
And I do want to just share that this as a learning moment. So kids, grown-ups don't know everything. We use the internet to find all the answers, so we believe in you to be able to do the same. All of the information of the world is at your fingertips. You guys are lucky you don't have to carry around encyclopedias.
And we're not
That's-
asking the internet, we're asking each other through the internet.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yes,
this is
exactly.
grown-ups talking to grown-ups and other kids and all of these people. Like, it's not just an oracle that we're talking to people who are curious about this and putting it up there for other people to learn about, which is beautiful.
I like to believe it's an oracle.
It's an oracle.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, more personal experience on the memory stuff. I'm actually a survivor of brain tumors, glioblastoma. So I understand the whole thing about, I can recall memories of nightmares I had when I was a little kid and some other weird memories from whenever. But some things are still lost to me, so it's sort of strange in that aspect. But I completely understand that whole concept.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
What you're talking about with regard to disease as it happens in the brain, if something like a tumor is going to come in, that's going to push things around, and if a nerve gets pushed too tight, sometimes that nerve can die, and the memories in that nerve are going to die too. Also, when someone does brain surgery, that's considered an injury, that's considered a trauma. Yes, thank you very much. So a traumatic brain injury is something that we're learning more about. It's something that we're learning a lot more in the last 10 years about what happens with football players and concussions, what happens in car accidents, what is the long-term effect of injuring which brain parts. And unfortunately, we're learning it's a lot more common than we thought, that we have better helmets now, we have better helmet laws now, but unfortunately, it's still going to be happening.
Is it really possible, like, if someone really has like a when they have a concussion, is there some parts in their memory, their brain, where they kind of think about flashbacks, like their childhood and how they try to prosper?
Yes. So when we access memories, it's coming through a set system. It goes from like this part to this part to this part to this part to our consciousness. And when we have injury, that system gets broken up. It's not as predictable that it's going to go here to here to here. So the memories come back at times that we might not be looking for them, or they might get blended in when we're looking for something kind of near them. In trauma, we know that there's actually a shortcut pathway that it's never supposed to be used except for emergencies. It's like that thing that you pull on the trolley to make it stop. So if something is sensed as close enough to being dangerous, it gets to skip the line and jump right to the front, and we have reflex action. So a lot of times people who have, for instance, a traumatic car wreck might be driving near that place where they had the car wreck, and suddenly they're acting in a way that they didn't plan to act. They might be like extra tense or drive really slow or like go out of their way not to go around it without thinking about it. And with a concussion, that it makes it also more unpredictable as to which memories are going to get which pathways preserved and which aren't.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's actually really interesting. I was just recently learning and reading about how you have your actual mental memories that you can work through. You can process grievances and trauma of your past, but that there's also your body memories and the chemistry that your body will admit. So even if you've worked through, like, I'm not going to get anxious when I fly anymore, your body's still going to tense up when it sees the plane and trying to get through like that.
And
Have it match, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the weirdest things is people who have amputations also develop memory loss. To suggest that there's a role in the way that our body works that either helps us how to access the memory, or maybe we're storing something out there. Maybe that's like a thumb drive, but in your actual thumb. And so if you lose it, you actually do lose whatever that was subtly helping you to access.
Do you think that is in any way linked to like how with PTSD you were saying that the mind is like, okay, I'm going to protect you from that? Could it be something that the memory of having that limb is just so like you mourn it so much that the brain's like, okay, let's not think about that anymore?
Yep. And we also know that people with a history of trauma, oftentimes when they get massage, it opens memories because there's places that we store things. It's unlikely that there's a memory in my shoulder muscle, but it could be part of like a key, and if you push my shoulder muscle, that somehow signals my brain it's okay to remember this now.
Yeah, it's called body armor. My sister's a massage therapist, and she said you have to be really aware going in that could be a problem.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, moderator of the show right here.
Yes.
When Captain Marvel, when they put Kree blood into Captain Marvel's body, did she keep her human blood or did they take it out?
Oof. In the comics, they always talk of it as kind of like a blend. Like in the comics, she has a blend of Kree, which is the name of the aliens that give her the blood transfusion, right? She has a blend of Kree DNA and human DNA. And when in the movie, they were kind of seeming it was almost like a blood transfusion. So it seems like she would have a mix. She lost a lot of blood in the injury, so she needed more blood to help her survive. But she would still have some human blood in there.
And the difference would be if it's a transfusion or a transplant. Inside your bones, there's something called the marrow. Our bones are hollow, and inside that's where we make all of our blood cells. And we make red blood cells that last about 3 months. So we're always making more blood cells every day. And there's not a blood cell in our system that's older than 3 months old. So if you took all my blood out and you filled me up with Kree blood, in about 3 months, it's all my blood again. But if you took all of my bone marrow out and put Kree bone marrow in, I'm gonna make Kree cells. So I know the movie didn't say specifically like what they did, but I think, didn't she have red blood at the end of the movie?
Right.
So I think it's more of like a transfusion. Like they took all of her blood out and they put Kree blood in, so for 3 months or so, she's at least partly gonna bleed blue. And then after that, probably not, but enough to give her the message that she's Kree now.
Thank you.
Good question.
Yes. I was wondering about wormholes, and since you've been talking much about black holes and white holes, I was wondering what you know about wormholes.
Well, wormholes, I guess, it's kind of the idea that there's not space and time aren't a separate thing, it's space-time, and there can be bends in space-time that allow you to travel, like the idea that there's faster than light travel, right? That kind of gets talked about in the movie. It's impossible for anything with matter to move faster than the speed of light. It's not possible. But the idea that you could move faster than the speed of light across a distance is that there is a like fold in space-time that kind of lets you, instead of taking a long path, take a shorter path. It's like a shortcut. So that's kind of like the idea of like a wormhole. It's almost like this shortcut through space-time.
That's a good example of where there's the boundary between what's real science and what's phony science, or what's science fiction and what's real science. And a lot of the things involving wormholes are theories. And so, you know, scientists, we like to use the word an unsubstantiated theory, and maybe you might say science fiction. There's a pretty fine line between the two, but wormholes are ideas of curving space and time, and it's a way to kind of look at things, but not experimentally verified.
And it's also kind of talked about to explain in the Thor movies. They kind of mention wormholes with like the Einstein-Rosen bridges that Thor, Natalie Portman, what's her name? I'm blanking.
Jane Foster.
Jane Foster. I know that, but was having trouble accessing that memory.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, all of her research is on the Einstein-Rosen bridge, which is a fancy term for a wormhole, and that was how she was explaining like accessing the other realms. So yeah.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that Captain Marvel's pager then just sends all of its signals through wormholes, and that's how
That
it
would make
gets-
sense.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question is, what was your favorite part about the movie? Like, what was your favorite science moment? And you're like, oh, this is really cool. And then my second question is, was there anything in the comics or the books that you're just like, this seems unreasonable?
Okay, I'm going to start with the bad because then I'm going to go to the good, okay? Did you read Kelly Sue DeConnick's run? There was a part where she had developed a Cree lobe in her brain. And either the writer didn't quite understand what the brain was, or the artist didn't understand what the brain was, because the pictures were not anything about a lobe of the brain. They were like a mohawk, and that's not what the brain is. Or I mean, I get it's not, but so that bothered me a lot. It was still a fine story, and it led to some really, really beautiful things about memory and self and meaning. But the actual Cree lobe itself was just not my bag. My favorite parts of the movie were less about the science and more about what it meant to see this on screen. I mean, we've seen Wonder Woman, we've seen other ways to talk about women in the screen, but this was so meaningful in that she didn't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or anything. She was developing something for herself in a way that we didn't get with Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman had a boyfriend, and it meant so much to me to say, we don't have to make a movie about how she's different from boys. We have to make a movie about who is she. And it felt so much more respectful when we have diversity that's less, oh, it's still all about the white guys, but this is how she's not a white guy. And saying, white guy is not the default. It doesn't have to be the default. So that was my favorite part.
I think my favorite, it's kind of tangentially science related. My favorite character in the movie was definitely Goose. This is kind of a spoiler, so maybe close your ears. But, you know, we find out in the comics, it's the same. It's a flurkin. So, not an actual cat, an alien race, member of an alien race. And I think the science of that is just like, first off, like, I believe that, you know, there's some sort of life out there. But what are the odds that life in a completely different environment would evolve to look exactly like a cat, but be completely different in every other aspect? And I think the odds would be very slim, but I thought it was very fun.
I think there actually, two of my co-hosts from Mythbusters Jr. just did a whole scientific article on the fingerprint scanner that they overcome by using a piece of tape. So that for me was like, okay, that wouldn't actually work. But there were so many amazing parts of the actual movie. And the one thing that I really liked, especially as a textile designer, is like watching the suits for the Kree Army, like when they change, when they go from like, now we're in space, and then now we're in water, and now we're on land, and you're just watching it evolve to be whatever it needs to be. And it kind of reminds me of like amphibious like vehicles where they can drive and then they float. So that, I just loved how they actually did that in the film. It just was beautifully done.
Did you see the movie?
I'm not going to comment on
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi.
Well, my question is, so we can see, in the movie and in the comics, we can see her, Carol, create these photon blasts. And I would assume or gather from context clues that the powers that she has came from like the accident blast, and that energy is coursing through her body. Mm-hmm. But if that were to happen, say, real life, so to speak, would there, if she's using energy as a weapon, is she drawing it from other people, other objects, or is she drawing it from within herself? And what would that effect have on her body physically and like on the outside and the inside? inside.
Yeah, so one of her powers, aside from the photon blasters, is that she's extremely durable. So obviously taking energy in like that, which is how in the comics they say that she does it, that she takes it, it's a transference of energy, and she does like a build up and then a throw out. In the film, it's a little bit different because it's like she kind of just always has it stored in her. We only see her really touch an object when she's heating a teapot. And in that case, she's not taking a cold teapot's energy. Again, she's just outbursting the energy. So we in Bull City, we talked about how like what it would take for Aquaman to be able to swim as fast as a U-boat, and it would be kind of similar because if she has to be able to make that much energy, she's going to have to be ingesting it. You know, the matter makes matter, so she's going to have to somehow be getting that energy into her body, whether it's through consumption or through absorption. And then again, that durability is so important because as she's expelling it, afterwards she doesn't get tired and lethargic and fall asleep because she suddenly doesn't have that energy. No, she's still fighting and going, which is in some ways, I guess we could say comparative to a parent that can lift a car off a child. You know, you get that adrenaline burst and you're faster, stronger, you know, quicker. But I think that she would definitely have to be taking in energy.
And I think kind of in the visual, like when she's all powered up, she almost has that kind of glow. And I think that could be explained scientifically with energy transfers. There, you don't get 100% of an energy when you're transferring between objects or whatever it is. There's going to be some lost, and that could explain the glow, that some of the energy she's losing is being like emitted as kind of maybe heat. A lot of times when you are losing energy like that, it's emitted as like thermal energy, and that could explain why she's kind of glowing. Maybe that's some of the energy she's losing when she's absorbing it or emitting it. It's not going to be 100%.
And if I were writing her, I would give her a sweet tooth because we know that carbs are more easily accessible, and I think that would be a fun place to put this character who's always really durable, but I would love her to have like a Hershey bar in her bomber jacket or something.
So you want her to be like Venom, where when he's not eating brains, he's eating chocolate all the time?
Well, also brains, but mostly chocolate.
Snickers.
Snickers.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. These are great questions.
Hello.
Hi.
So, in the movie, the Kree have like really advanced technology, and that's part of what makes their suits so adaptable. Hypothetically, would that be achievable technology, or is that like alien stuff?
I think the adaptability is something, because we've figured out how to do it in vehicles, it's only a matter of time until we're able to do it in textiles as well. I think the bigger question would be the lightweightness of it and the ability to actually move around in it, and also the time that it takes to change over. You know, like an amphibious vehicle, you know, takes time to actually do a full changeover, so theirs was just so instantaneous. The one thing I did kind of think, oh, that we're nowhere near that, and it's going to be a while before we can get there, was the way that they would go from just having a helmet to suddenly having a full encased shield so that they could be in space. So like as a diver, you can get full shields so that you can actually still talk and get the oxygen that you need, but to be able to just have it kind of form, I would be worried that the seal, like there may be cracks, there may be like little indications where you're suddenly losing oxygen out into this atmosphere.
Yeah, when you make things today, all of the different parts are fairly big. There isn't something called nano manufacturing, but people are now working on making little parts. Think of actually motors and all different kinds of parts, but now they're really, really tiny. So you don't have any of that today. And in order to do that kind of thing, you'd actually need all sorts of parts that are really small. And so you might call that nano meaning really, really tiny machines and parts that you could put together to make all this possible. And people, believe it or not, people are working on all of that today.
And we need some PIM particles, right? That would help shrink everything down.
Also, you're standing right in front of a really big section of cosplayers over there, and they can tell you how hard it is to do adaptable costumes. For the movies, what they do is they do multiple versions of the same costume and then just kind of magic it together. So the fact that the really expensive costume people can't do it yet is is a place that this is an area for us to research.
Yeah, and there are some cases where, like, you'll see in magic shows or large plays where there's suddenly they go from one dress to another, but it's a layering effect that adds so much weight to the performer. So again, when you're trying to be aerodynamic and be able to, get through space and then not sink as soon as you're in an ocean, and be able to actually physically walk on shore. I mean, as a diver coming out of a shore dive, it is hard just with a tank on to be able to make landfall. So being able to get to that nano point is going to be pretty vital to make it real life possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This question is probably lean more towards Matt's specialty. What is the link between, because I know there was that biker chick that took her own life and they think she may have suffered from a concussion. What is the link between like head trauma and mental health, other than the chemical imbalance?
Well, and actually there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance. We can't use that in advertising anymore because there's been no proof that an adjustment of chemical changes any physical part of our brains. There's more to it than just that, but the idea, chemical imbalance is something that is sold to us by the advertising agency, and it's not coming from science. And I think it's great that we look to where is the science and how do we scientifically explain how to protect people who have these kinds of injuries. And this is super serious, but before I love your dress so much, and it gets a round of applause. Okay, so the deal with a traumatic brain injury or a concussion and suicide is that we often, when someone has a very public suicide, we say, oh, they must have been very depressed. And unfortunately, that's not true. Depression and suicide have something in common, but they're not exactly the same link. Suicide is much more closely linked to impulsivity, and as a result, we see it more commonly in people with alcohol dependence. If we're drinking, we aren't making really good decisions. We're being really impulsive. If we're depressed, we're kind of sitting with that for a while, and it can be awful to carry. It can be an impossible burden, but for the most part, someone is trying to find a way to make sense of things. Whereas an in-the-moment problem is much more, I feel bad, I'm sure I'm always going to feel bad, so I'm just going to do something. And with a traumatic brain injury, we do notice that people with the traumatic brain injury, especially in the frontal lobe, we lose a lot of the ability to down-regulate what we want to do. We lose a lot of our impulse control, and so impulsivity comes much more importantly. And that's why it's important to make sure that yes, reach out to your friends who have depression, but it's more important to make sure that we all know, no matter what our outsides look like, that we're in a community and that we can reach out to each other. If someone were to impulsively say something, but also knew they could impulsively text somebody, that could save a life. And it doesn't matter if you have a brain injury or depression or any of the other disorders. We all can be a part of a community and we all can be there for each other.
Okay.
So,
Thanks.
thank you for asking.
Thank you. Any more questions? These have all been so amazing. No? Yes?
One question.
We have more time, so feel free to line up.
This is, oh God. This isn't really about like science, sorry. But do you have any favorite like Captain Marvel issues, like for comics?
I do, actually. I'm blanking on the number, but this is from the Kelly Sue run right after the Kree Loeb stuff. There's an issue where Captain Marvel, in recovering from the brain problem that she had, she loses all of her memories and she has to kind of get her life back. And there's one issue where there's a little girl who's her neighbor and comes over every Tuesday for superhero lessons. And she shows up at Captain Marvel's house and is like, okay, time for superhero lessons. And she's like, I'm sorry, I don't remember anything. I can't teach you. And she says, no, I'm teaching you. And that got me so hard, this idea that we learn from each other. And that Captain Marvel, this very powerful person, has to have a child tell her how to be a hero again was so true, was so real.
What's the name of the writer again?
Kelly Sue DeConnick.
Okay.
I'm blanking on the name of the storyline right before it, but it's one of the last issues of her run on Captain Marvel.
In 2012, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it was.
It's before she goes to space.
Yeah, it's well before space, well before superhero Secret Wars.
Comics are a little confusing. Kelly Sue DeConnick wrote 2 different Captain Marvel series. So there's one series where it kind of goes back and explains her origin, and I think that's from that series. And then there's a second series where it kind of goes into where we meet Chewie and the Flurkin, and she's out in space, kind of hanging out in space. That is my favorite run on Captain Marvel. Gosh, I think 2014. But if you just look it up, it's you'll see there's 2 sets of Captain Marvel runs that Kelly Sue DeConnick wrote, and I really like the second one. I think it's a lot of fun. I love Chewie. Goose in the movie. Carol's a big Star Wars nerd in the comics, so she actually names him Chewie for Chewbacca. So I like that run, and I also like Chris Claremont writes the character a lot in his run on Uncanny X-Men. She shows up a lot, and he's kind of driving force behind her becoming binary. I really like that take on the character. She's not Captain Marvel yet. She's still called Ms. Marvel. Well, she eventually becomes known as binary, but I really like that storyline.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so going back to, it's really weird hearing your voice through this thing all the time. Okay, the energy absorption thing, so if everything is made up of energy, there's energy all around us, why does everybody always have to touch something or someone to absorb energy? Why can't they just absorb it standing here?
I would assume it's a self-preservation thing, right? If you're just constantly taking it in, then it could be an issue overall, like long-term, like if she gets too much energy into her. So my assumption would be that she's like on default off until she actually wants to absorb the energy.
Well, I think you don't have to touch to absorb energy when you're sitting outside and there's the sun, you know, you're taking it in and you're reacting to it. Okay, it's not touching you, but yet you're absorbing it. So I think probably, you know, when you touch something, I mean, that's obviously a vehicle, a fictional vehicle. But so maybe I think you're making maybe indirectly a really good point that you actually can take it in energy a lot of different ways, not just by touching something.
Yeah, there's a lot of different types of energy transfer. There's radiation. That's a form of energy transfer. Conduction, I believe, is that's through touch. Convection. There's several more, but yeah, you can absorb energy in a lot of different ways. You don't just touch something and get it like that.
And if we think about sound energy, sound travels better the denser the material. You can hear me through the air, but if we were underwater, you could hear me when I was much quieter because the liquid is denser than the air. And so I think maybe the touch would be sort of minimizing, there's no air between, so you've just got a solid and solid.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're going to wrap up to let the next panel come in, but we want to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation and being a part of it, and the questions were absolutely amazing. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of the con.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara, for being a great moderator.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you for being my geniuses.